Americans for Fair Taxation presents the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, president of Americans for Fair Taxation, and recorded by Bob Paxton, a volunteer with the Florida FAIRtax Educational Association. And now, this week's Chairman's Report.
Hello, I'm Bob Paxton with the AFFT Chairman's Report for Friday, October 27th, 2023. The FAIRtax, the best way to ensure that Social Security is funded. Now, it's a basic truth that no one wants to be put out of a job because they're no longer needed. This is particularly true of the smart people who work for the various organizations in D.C. that exist to analyze and propose learned solutions to problems they believe exist in our society. Now, while they'll protest that this isn't so, these organizations must know that if they actually solve the problem, they would reduce the justification for their existence because their solutions would no longer be needed. Consequently, they often recommend band-aid solutions that they know will only partially solve the problem at best. That way, they can claim to be making progress and continue to justify paying people to make learned pronouncements but not put forth any real solutions. Now, one of the pressing issues of our society is the solvency of Social Security. There are 55.8 million people over age 65. That's about 16.8% of the population. According to the Social Security fact sheet published by the Social Security Administration, nearly 9 out of 10 people aged 65 and older were receiving a Social Security benefit as of June 30th, 2023. Social Security benefits represent about 30% of the income of people over age 65. Among Social Security beneficiaries aged 65 and older, 37% of men and 42% of women receive 50% or more of their income from Social Security. Among that same group, 12% of men and 15% of women rely on Social Security for 90% or more of their income. Now, unlike younger people, almost all the population over 65 does not have the same opportunity as the younger people to go get a job to supplement any reduction to their Social Security benefits. The other group that's often not considered are the children and relatives of those over 65 who would be compelled to help out financially if Social Security benefits were reduced. The 2022 Social Security Trustees Report says that unless the funding problem is solved, the system will only be able to pay Social Security recipients 77% of their full benefits beginning in 2034. Now, that would be disastrous for many seniors who are just barely getting by on 100% of their benefit. Yep, the Social Security problem is real, and it's becoming more and more of a ticking time bomb. A recent study by the Economic Policy Institute warned us that a record share of earnings was not subject to Social Security taxes in 2021. The study pointed out that Social Security payroll taxes are not collected on earnings over a set cap. In 2021, this cap was $142,800. So workers making more than this paid no Social Security taxes on their earnings in excess of the cap. However, rising income inequality is skewing this tax structure even further to the benefit of top earners and diminishing funding for the crucial retirement program that so many Americans rely on. Social Security's payroll tax, of which employees pay 6.2% and employers pay 6.2% each, has a cap that rises with growth in the National Average Wage Index compiled by the Social Security Administration. In 2023, for example, the cap was set at $160,200. But since wage growth for top earners continues to outpace average wage growth, a growing share of total earnings is spilling over the cap and escaping taxation, thus eroding Social Security revenues. Now, significant reforms to Social Security made in 1983 set the cap at a level so that 90% of all earnings would be subject to the Social Security tax. Over time, though, rising inequality meant that this share shrank as more earnings for higher wage workers spilled over the cap. In 2020 and 2021, the share of earnings subject to Social Security taxes hit the lowest level since before the 1983 reform. In fact, by 2021, the share of earnings subject to Social Security taxes was at the lowest level in nearly 50 years. Now, the authors of this study believe this earnings analysis is important for two reasons. One, First, Social Security is likely to be under threat in coming years as part of a general return to debates over long-run fiscal sustainability in the United States. Second, a recent debate on earnings inequality trends has rightly highlighted a pronounced compression of wages among the bottom 90% of workers. But the Social Security data we highlight in this brief shows that continued growth at the very top of the earnings distribution, the top 1% and above, continues to exceed growth in the bottom 99% of the workforce. This means that there has been very little, or actually no, compression between earnings for the bottom 90% and those at the very top of the earnings distribution. According to their latest research using SSA data, annual earnings rose fastest for the top 1% of earners, up 9.4%, and the top 1/10% was up 18.5%. While those at the bottom 90% saw their real earnings fall 0.2% between 2020 and 2021. They advocate increasing or even eliminating the cap on earnings so that more of the cost of Social Security are paid with taxes on higher earners. Now, obviously, the increase in revenue to the Social Security system will help, but it doesn't solve the problem, and it doesn't address a more fundamental issue. That's the declining number of workers having to support an increasing number of people receiving Social Security. So, this is just another Band-Aid, not a real solution. In conclusion, the solution is to pass the FAIRtax. With the FAIRtax, the Social Security Trust Fund is no longer funded by the decreasing number of workers, but by a tax on the consumption of new retail goods and retail services by everyone who buys things in the United States. So, why doesn't Congress eagerly embrace this easy solution? Well, the more cynical among us may suspect that Congress and D.C. like the idea of having 56 million people dependent on them if Social Security starts going broke. They like the idea that they're able to keep the corrupt federal income payroll tax in place and present themselves as our protectors against abuses by the IRS, while at the same time providing much greater funding to the IRS. And they also like the idea that talking about problems rather than actually solving them will keep many smart people and bureaucrats employed that might not be needed if a real solution was found and implemented. President Biden and Congress, why not pass the FAIRtax and do the right thing for the American people and fix the broken income payroll tax system? Why don't you go down in history as the ones who made Social Security solvent for all present and future Americans, and the ones who transferred power back to the American people over how much tax they pay? Now, D.C. hates that the FAIRtax will be enforced by the states, not by the IRS and not by D.C. bureaucrats. Members of Congress hate that they won't be able to get huge contributions by threatening to eliminate a tax break for wealthy taxpayers. The FAIRtax transfers power from Congress and bureaucrats to the people. We, not D.C., will decide how much federal tax we pay. Now, only businesses or people who sell new retail goods or provide retail services will have to collect the FAIRtax and remit it to the government. Now, since less than 10% of the retailers in this country account for 90% of retail purchases, there will be much less opportunity for evasion. So why would D.C. pass the FAIRtax and give up this almost unlimited source of donations? Well, they won't, at least not voluntarily. The only way they will is if the rest of us demand it. Isn't it time to end this ludicrous tax collection system and the IRS along with it? Now, there's going to be a vote on the FAIRtax in the House of Representatives. The elites didn't want it, but it was forced on them. So we now have the opportunity to force all members of the House to show where they stand. They can vote for the present income payroll tax system, or they can vote for the FAIRtax. They can support the corrupt income tax in the IRS, or they can vote to eliminate it. It can't be any simpler than that. They can hide the true cost of their government, or pass the FAIRtax and show everyone the true cost of government on every retail receipt. And finally, they can support the largest transfer of power from the government to the people, the FAIRtax, or they can vote against it. Now, if members think the FAIRtax needs to be amended to address a problem, then they can propose the change. Don't let them get away with rejecting the entire bill because it has a perceived flaw that can be easily addressed. Please stand with us and demand that your representatives support a much fairer, much simpler, and much more efficient way to fund the government, the FAIRtax. The FAIRtax doesn't pick winners and losers. Because it taxes spending, not earnings, the FAIRtax lets everyone save for their retirement tax-free. The FAIRtax will allow us to take back control. The income payroll tax system is broken. It's no longer working. We can't repair it, but we can replace it with the FAIRtax. Join us and take back control of our country and our lives, not with bullets, but with the elimination of one of the biggest threats to our liberty and economic prosperity, the income payroll tax. We should all remember Edmund Burke's warning that applies to our efforts to take back control. Nobody made a greater mistake than he who did nothing because he could only do a little. We should also remember this quote from George Orwell's 1984, which, if we do nothing, may foretell your and your children's future. If you want a picture of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. So what can each of us do? We can write letters and make calls to our elected representatives and attend Zoom town hall meetings demanding that if they really want to allow Americans to take back control, the first step is to eliminate the income payroll tax system and enact the FAIRtax. Take back control. Help us pass the FAIRtax. Help us bring about real tax reform and stop future IRS abuses. By contributing or investing $10.40 a month, you help provide a financial base to Americans for fair taxation. Now, if you can make larger contributions/investments, these will be used not for salaries, as we're all volunteers, but for the needed updates to our economic studies, which will be vital for all future years. Please go to FAIRtax.org and invest in AFFT. It's an investment in your and your family's future.
This has been the Weekly Chairman's Report, written by Steve Hayes, President of Americans for Fair Taxation. Check back every week for news and information about the FAIRtax and learn why the FAIRtax should replace our antiquated federal income tax system. If you'd like to receive a copy of the Chairman's Report in your inbox every week, sign up at FAIRtax.org.